Hi, hi everyone. So this is the Europe IR lecture, and today we're just going to be going over Europe, the European Union, relations between different countries, and how other countries like the United States, China, and various others have been interacting with this continent. Now, I know a lot of people probably know about Europe, and we see it at the surface, but whether you're doing public forum like in Douglas, Congress, or extemp, there's a lot to learn about Europe and how it can react with different aspects of international relations theory and international relations strategy. So without further ado, let's dive into it. Also, yes, I'm pretty much aware that some of you are only watching this because you have AP Euro this year, so I guess I'll just live with that sad fact and continue on. So, Europe. A history. Actually, no, we are not going over the history of Europe for various reasons. First, you have a whole class on this in high school, as we just went over, and just by College Board for not having AP Asia, AP Africa, or AP Americas, I am just going to ignore European history unless it is absolutely necessary. Again, College Board can decide to be fair, or they can just keep doing what they do. That is totally fine with me. But moving along to the actual content. So Europe at the surface. Since the beginning of history, Europe has been divided by different cultures, regions, languages, and power struggles. As a result, it was only after the catastrophe of World War II that European countries started to band together towards progress rather than fight amongst each other for the scraps. So we all know what happened in World War II. We don't need to go over it, but it is important to know the context to what's going to next, the European Union. So the European Union in itself is an international organization, but oftentimes will operate as a regional bloc that has jurisdiction run by governmental institutions. Those institutions we will get to later. And it's really important that we go over the European Union as a whole and within its institutions, just so we get an idea of how this relates to debate. Hold on, let me just get that away. So basically, the European Union is guided by the principles of intergovernmentalism. This is a theory in international relations that most commonly has been the embodiment of the European Union. So basically, what it is, hold on, I have a book on this, so let me just see if I can come and find it. Hold on, we are almost there. All right. So intergovernmentalism is basically the view of European integration that argues that the guiding force behind integration is the interest and power of individual states. So basically, intergovernmentalism is this theory that, okay, we're all going to band together and help each other as states. This inherently goes against realist theory, which states that countries will work together, but they don't necessarily want to integrate within culture because they believe at the end of the day that everyone is in a battle for sovereignty and dominance. So intergovernmentalism really did change the realist theory that ruled over the European Union for quite some time. Now, interestingly enough, there are currently 20 members of the European Union, soon 27 because of Brexit, which we will get to later. But believe it or not, there are a total of 44 European countries, meaning that the majority of these people are not in the European Union. Like, there is a clear divide between those in the Union, which are mostly in Western Europe, and then those who are lesser developed or under the Soviet Iron Curtain and have since been left out of the European Union. And getting into the EU isn't as easy as one would think. You have to make an adjustment to several standards for democracy, political systems, economics, social integration, immigration, acceptance. It's a lot that some of these countries like the Maldives or those in the Balkans can't really fare right now. So now that we've checked that, we need to look at some important terms. So I believe the first important term that we should go over is supernationalism, and that's another theory. The theory basically states that it's the view of European integration that emphasizes the powers the EU has gained over nation states so that it can compel them to act in certain ways. So this really was the evolution of the EU. At first, the EU was intergovernmentalism, where it was like, we're all going to help each other. But supranationalism resulted into this power hoarding dynamic where countries like France, Germany were all trying to gain control of the union rather than spread out the wealth. And it has led to some movements such as Brexit because many people, again, under realist theory, believe that their democracy is at risk. Then we move on to the Treaty of Rome. So one thing that we need to know is that the European Union was not just created, right? It was created in 1991 under the Maastricht Treaty, which is listed down below. But before that point, there were other sub-European Union attempts and trial runs that kind of had success, but also inevitably failed. So the first one was the Treaty of Rome. The Treaty of Rome essentially was signed in 1957, this expanded early integration efforts with the goal of a common market and an ever closer union of European countries. So basically what this means is this was their first attempt to have trade. Because after World War II, everyone was dead broke. No one had infrastructure. So this whole economic battle that they were going against, which we will talk about in the war lecture, essentially went away. So these countries through the Treaty of Rome tried to work together. It didn't last long and eventually led to the European coal and steel community. This was this was before, sorry. It was the precursor to the Treaty of Rome. And this was not even a program. It was just European countries trading steel and coal with each other with no tariffs. It was, let's see if we could all have access to these really good goods. Sorry for that redundancy. But after the Treaty of Rome and the European coal and steel community came the European Economic Community, which is still standing today. Basically, this was an earlier version of the EU, and it was created in 1957, slightly after the Treaty of Rome, and it was charged with lowering trade barriers and creating a common market for goods, labor, and capital. This is what we know today as the Eurozone. European Economic Community's main purpose is to unify everyone under a single monetary policy so that trade is easier and they don't have to worry about currency exchanges. It isn't this idea of creating a United States of Europe. It's purely to what is better for these countries fiscally. But then that leads to neo-functionalism, which is another theory that has run the European Union for quite some time. This is the idea that economic integration would build momentum and gradually spill over into other political and geopolitical realms. This is where the European Union comes to a halt, right? This idea of neo-functionalism is as long as we have a strong economy, eventually we're going to agree on other things, right? This is the idea that China has with the Communist Party. They're like, look, we'll keep you sustained with a good economy, but we're going to limit your civil rights. Eventually, as we've seen right now with the Hong Kong protest, that's not exactly working. And we see it also within the European Union. There are a lot of countries like Greece, Italy, Spain, and several others who are not happy with their limited power, yet at the same time, they are told that if the whole organization is doing well economically, then everything else will eventually spill over. And that's not how geopolitics works, and that's something that one would have to argue in public forum. Also, if anyone has any questions, please tell them in the Slack or the Facebook live stream. That would be very helpful, or you can message me on the Slack. But finally, we move on to the Single European Act, right? This is right before the Maastricht Treaty. And the Single European Act, otherwise known as C, was adopted in 1986, but forth a timetable to remove barriers to trade and create a common market by 1992, and expanded the powers of the European community to new areas such as the environment. So this was the idea of bringing neo-functionalism to the application. If any examples have worked with me before, this is a really good example of theory app in actual politics, right? Because neo-functionalism is this theory that if we work together in economics, we'll work together on other things. And the Single European Act is the application of this, where, okay, now the European community is going to tackle things like climate change and the environment. As we've seen, that has been somewhat successful with countries such as Sweden and Norway. The problem and the core flaw of the European Union is that many of these countries have distinct problems, policies, and histories to where a universal plan doesn't exactly work. It's one of the reasons why the United Nations is one of the most ineffective international organizations in the world, and why they need so many committees. But finally, we go to the Maastricht Treaty. This was the official establishment of the European Union and its various pillars and institutions that are still standing today. A note for everyone. All of these theories and terms, although a lot, are important towards arguing about the EU and making our judges understand the functionality of the organization. There is no way that you can truly argue or give a speech about the European Union without using at least one or two of these theories, or just having the knowledge in the back of your mind. It makes you have a more nuanced argument rather than just relying on statistics. You can say how fundamentally the EU is flawed or good, or you can argue how politicians operate under this system. Knowing the building blocks of the European Union is quintessential to truly debating about the European Union. But let's move on to the first pillar, which is economics. This is everyone's favorite topic. I get complaints all the time. I hate economics. It's the worst. But trust me, it's good for you. It's like vegetables. All right, so the first pillar of economics is the ECB. So the first pillar, to be clear, the pillars in general create institutions and policy initiatives that then the EU goes and follows by. So if someone in, let's say, I'm going to talk to my Congress kids right now, if someone in Congress is saying how we need to work with the European Union or work with a certain country part of the Union on, let's say, immigration, right? We want to work on immigration. We can't necessarily do that without talking to the whole EU, and specifically the committees and institutions under the pillar that it encompasses, because it has a lot of layers. So let's break down the ECB, which is part of the first pillar. The ECB, otherwise known as the European Central Bank, is a central bank for the euro and administers monetary policy within the Eurozone, which we just went over. This comprises 19 member states of the European Union and is one of the largest monetary areas of the world. If you look down below, we have something called the banking union. This is a part of the ECB. And basically what this banking union does, hold on, that was not supposed to happen. And basically what the ECB does is that it has the single supervisory mechanism. And this mechanism eventually just works as a resolution for uniform approach in banking supervision, right? This is to ensure that there is no fraud within European banks, particularly when it's being facilitated for the ECB. Because the ECB is in charge of currency exchanges for those who are not part of the Eurozone, and they're also a part of interest rates and monetary policy, because those in the Eurozone have the same currency. It's kind of like how our Federal Reserve works in the United States, if that makes sense, just combined also a little bit with the Treasury Department, because it also works with governments not part of the Eurozone. It's a little complicated, but over time it gets easier. Then there's the single resolution mechanisms. Again, that's in this little thing below. I'm just going to wait for that to fade away. All right, the single resolution mechanism, basically it's uniform rules for banking resolutions. This is to go over disputes. It's kind of like how the World Trade Organization has its own courts for going over unfair trade policies. And then finally, it's the European Deposit Insurance Scheme. This basically ensures that initial deposits are safe from scandal and fraud so that there's not a massive crisis in the economy. Because remember, a lot of the European economy, or any economy in general, is stabilized through its liquid assets. Liquid assets being tangible currency and wealth. And when that money is lost for fraud, that can bring down a lot of consumer confidence, it can bring down a lot of liquid assets, and it could cause an unstable economy, which is something that the ECB can't afford. Thus, we need to move on to the European social model, which is kind of like why the ECB needs to do well. This is the idea that most governments work to attract and not discourage foreign investment, while at the same time providing social services to their workers. But this does not occur when it comes to austerity. I like to bring up the European social model because it's an interesting idea, and it's oftentimes what Americans will cite when going as to how we can improve on healthcare, social security, free education. The European social model works in some areas. When the ECB and the currency matches the strength of an economy like Germany, then they're able to have the money and wealth to provide universal healthcare and to provide free education and to tax their people without facing any political or socioeconomic repercussions. However, if you're a country like Greece where your growth isn't that strong and your currency can't really handle the euro, then the opposite comes true. You eventually default into your debt because you're taxing so much to pay for these programs that are lackluster to begin with because they don't have the money to fund them. And then eventually what happens is the ECB, the European Commission, and even at times the IMF will institute what's known as an austerity measure. This measure essentially forbids a country in debt from spending an investment and growth programs. They have to cut already struggling social programs just so they can level out their debt to growth ratio. This is not the way to do economics because it does not take into regard the specific problems of a country or as to why they were in debt in the first place. It's a universal rule that really undermines the European social model, which is somewhat based in utilitarianism. So for you LDers out here, the European social model could in fact be your best friend. But then let's move on to the Eurozone. We kind of went over this, but we'll go over it again. It's a monetary union. There's only 19 of the 28 European member states, and it has a common currency and sole legal tender. Monetary authority of the Eurozone is the Euro system. Interestingly enough, what makes the Eurozone complicated is that the Eurozone has a single monetary policy, but everyone has a different fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is basically budgeting, taxes, stuff that was considered so intertwined with sovereignty that countries were refusing to give it up. The problem with this, though, is that when the ECB and the Euro system can't monitor budgets or taxes in a way where it can help these countries, it just fluctuating with its monetary policy results in defaults, right? In the United States, for example, we have a Federal Reserve that regulates monetary policy, but we also have the IRS, which goes over our tax revenue. We also have Congress and the executive that go over our budget. They work knowing what the monetary policy is going to be in advance. Whereas when it comes to these countries in the Eurozone, they're stuck. They're forced to adapt to the monetary policy rather than have the monetary policy adapt to them. And with fighting over who really controls the fiscal policy, it creates a lot of problems. So there's only two solutions. One, you get rid of the unitary monetary policy, and you just have a free trade zone, similar to the AFCTA, the new African Free Trade Agreement, or you come up with a unified fiscal policy to balance things out. But again, that requires giving up sovereignty, and that could spark other nations already wanting to leave the EU, such as Poland, to really make that breakaway. So I'm glad that we went over that. Now let's look at the second pillar, foreign policy and security, because everyone was scared of Russia. This is the only reason this exists, because no one liked Russia. But we'll move on with that. So, security and foreign policy in a nutshell. There are more institutions that deal with this, and there are more policy initiatives, but I'd be here all day if I went over all of them. So, to make things brief, we're going to go over the big three. The first one is the EU Security Commission Council. The Security Committee examines all matters regarding the protection of EU classified information and makes recommendations to the Council as necessary. This includes EU rules, policies, agreements on exchanging classified information with third states, international organizations, and arrangements on sharing classified information across the EU family of institutions, bodies, and agencies. Basically, this is the NSA. I'm not even going to sugarcoat it. The EU Security Commission Council is essentially this group that monitors data. And it'll go up with the next slide or the second slide after that, one of the two, because they're the ones who are passing policies like the GDPR. They're the ones making this recommendation because they realize that when you have the data of over 19 to 28 countries, if one person hacks the system, they have a lot of power. And in the cybersecurity lecture, we'll go over the nuances of that. But for now, just keep in mind that the EU Security Commission Council is specific to cybersecurity, information, and copyright. Moving along, we have the Common Security and Defense Policy. This basically has over a $200 billion budget and encompasses military action and hard power foreign policy. Believe it or not, the European Union does not have a military. They work for NATO, but there is no military that the EU can just declare to go to combat with whenever it feels like. However, at the same time, this organization basically helps flesh out military initiatives and foreign policy goals for the rest of the member states. So at least they're on the same page. Finally, we have the Lisbon Treaty of 2009. This played a central part to reforming the security and foreign policy pillar, because with the entry into the force of the Lisbon Treaty in 2009 and its subsequent implementation, the European Union has gradually assembled the constituent elements of a sui generis, otherwise known as foreign policy, bringing together various competencies, instruments, and resources that were hitherto spread across different institutions and bodies. Essentially, what this means is that Europe can now function outside within the continent. The European Union can now start engaging with terrorist organizations such as Boko Haram. They can start giving aid to countries within sub-Saharan Africa. They can start engaging in free trade deals such as Mercosur in Latin America. And they can freely start having more pivoted and aggressive foreign policy. Because after World War II, for that context, Europe was only concerned about itself. But now it's trying to become a pillar of the liberal international order and really help direct foreign policy, whereas, as we can see with the Trump administration, the US is failing. Moving along. The EU Cybersecurity Act of 2019. This is a complex idea. Okay, I forgot to put in the text for this image, but won't worry, I'll just go over it. The EU Cybersecurity Act of 2019 is an initiative that essentially wants European countries to start making increases in investment for their firewalls, for tech specialists, particularly with Russian propaganda. After 2006, when they saw the US elections being hacked, the French elections being hacked, and the European parliamentary elections this year at a severe risk, they decided that they needed an initiative where they would band together to create a better cybersecurity infrastructure. This, again, was sponsored by the second pillar. So if you do want to make an argument in extent about a specific way that the European Union can help combat against digital warfare, using the second pillar as a main point of analysis really does separate you from the rest of the crowd. But this leads us to some interesting news articles that I really want to go over. So the first one, I'm not sure if you all, okay, so you're not seeing this. Hold on, okay, so you're not seeing this. All right, so I will be sharing this slide here, and basically what these are is that these are articles pertaining to what currently is going on with the second pillar. So the first one is that the European Union wants new military operation proposals. The second one is that Angela Merkel wants a European military. Ironic. And then the third one is just a really funny one that I thought would be put in there. How Trump doesn't want the EU to have a military because he believes that they already have NATO, and he sees this as a threat. And that's something I really want to discuss. In the world where the European Union potentially does get its own military, we have to understand that other nations would not take it lightly. Many in the developing world would view it as a new age of colonialism. Honestly, in some ways, Europe is starting to become the United States in terms of foreign policy back in the early 2000s, where it's trying to become a military superpower, and it's really trying to reassert its dominance. However, this is not always for the best, because as we know, Western-centric military prowess is not always the answer. They don't understand the conflict most of the time, they won't put in all the resources necessary, and they will almost always resort to hard power to gain resources. I'm going off a bit, but I will save the rest of that tidbit for the war lecture. Moving along. The third pillar, justice and home affairs. Basically, this is the DOJ. And I would say the Department of Homeland Security, but this is also where things get a bit messy. So, the Court of Justice of the European Union ensures EU law is applied in the same way in all EU countries and settles legal disputes between national governments and EU institutions. In certain circumstances, it can also be used by citizens, companies, or organizations to take action against an EU institution which may have infringed their rights. So the whole point about the third pillar is upholding the rights of EU citizens and to ensure justice amongst the human body. So the Court of Justice of the European Union is one of the most prominent courts in the land. It kind of acts like the Supreme Court within the European Union. This is where big cases are made and where the people do actually get power against EU institutions. Albeit, most of the time, this court is sometimes flawed because it does have governmental biases. But this leads us to the second part of the third pillar. The EU works to improve internal security by cooperating on law enforcement, border management, civil protection, and disaster management. This includes taking action against organized criminals and helping national police forces work better together for the European Police Office, otherwise known as Europol. Europol has had a controversial run because, again, people view it as an international police force within the EU, and they also believe that at times they have been unlawfully targeting Eastern Europeans, and at the same time that Russia has somehow infiltrated Europol. Europol is definitely something that you need to know about if you're going to debate about the European Union, whether it be a theory debate in LD or a PF topic about European security. Europol must be quintessential to your argument because it is a very fluctuating factor and can be just a little tidbit of hypocrisy or added bonus to sell your case or speech. And just down below, we're going to go over all this lovely jibble-jabble of how EU citizens enjoy democracy and protections. What you need to know is that this is all protected under EU treaties and the Charter of Fundamental Rights, more namely the Charter of Fundamental Rights. It's kind of like the Bill of Rights or the US Constitution even for the European Union, or it's like you can't discriminate against people. Everyone's entitled to a job. Stuff like that. So it's important to know your legal jargon, especially if you're going to be going for deeper analysis in the future. And remember when I said before that things were going to get messy? This is where they get messy. So, since 2015, Germany has taken in more than 1.4 million people under its open border immigration law. But that could change soon. This was Vox Media, June 2018. I bring this quote because it shows a very heated debate in Europe right now, and one that isn't particularly the most flattering for the region, but basically there has been a debate as to how far the third pillar goes in terms of immigration and accepting amnesty for these immigrants. A lot of people on the Germany side are saying that they should accept them, that these refugees coming from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, North Africa, and various other regions deserve to come in. But then there are also some opposition. Even the French president at times has been working with the Libyan government to send back refugees who then just end up being enslaved or human trafficked. Then you have countries like Poland and Hungary, which really don't want refugees and have taken violent action against them and legal action as well. So this is a very contentious topic. But when arguing for immigration in the European Union, you must bring in the third pillar, because that is the core of government and political theory that will defend it best. We are almost done with the European Union, don't worry, but now we're going to go off into the Lisbon Treaty, because now that we know what the European Union's goals are and what it's trying to do, we need to break down how it works, right? So the Lisbon Treaty, which came into force in late 2009, brought new lawmaking powers to the European Parliament, and it put it on an equal footing with the Council of Ministers in deciding what the EU does and how money is spent. It also changed the way the Parliament works with other institutions and gave MEPs more influence on who runs the EU. All these reforms ensured that by casting your vote in the European elections, you get to have an even greater say on where Europe is heading. So in the past, the European Council had all the power. But now it seems as though, with the Lisbon Treaty, that the European Parliament, and by that token, the people have a stronger voice when it comes to the legislative process. The Lisbon Treaty is a perfect example of how the idea of the social contract really coming into play here. Jacques Rousseau's social contract basically says you give up power, but you also have the government serve you. Well, in the past, the government wasn't really serving the European people because it was all a bunch of bureaucrats and elites running the council. Most of the people in the council are prime ministers and presidents and heads of state. But now that the European Parliament has this power, it's giving more of a voice to elected officials and in turn serving citizens more. Let's move on to institutions. We love institutions. So, institutions are pretty important when it comes to the European Union. It's basically the working organs. So, the European Council, let's start there. The European Council, and formerly the EUCO, is a collective body that defines the European Union's overall political direction and priorities. It compromises the heads of state or government of the EU's member states, along with the President of the European Council and the President of the European Commission. This leads us to the European Commission. The European Commission is the executive branch of the European Union, responsible for proposing legislation, implementing decisions, upholding the EU treaties, and managing the day-to-day business of the EU. To put things in context, the EU Commission is the one that's currently dealing with the Brexit crisis right now. The EU Commission is that organization that has the final say when it comes to legislation. It's like if you combine the Senate and the executive branch together, for layman's terms. Moving along, we are going to the EU Parliament. We went over this. It's basically Parliament where they have a massive general election, and all across Europe, not just within countries, parties representing the European Union, or who are Eurosceptic, people who don't believe in the Union yet participate in the process anyways, go up and run for election. They then help legislate policy And then they work with the European Commission and the Council of the European Union to exercise the tripartite legislative function of the European Union, which we're now going to go over. So, this is how policy works. Bear with me. So we have the European Council of National Leaders. They set the priorities. Then the European Commission will propose a legislation and a budget. In turn, the European Parliament will either appoint and scrutinize people in the European Commission, or they will decide to negotiate or amend the legislation. They have those options. Then there's the Council of Ministers, ministers from each member state. They then can do the same thing. They can appoint people to the European Council, but they can't scrutinize. And in addition to that, they could also help negotiate the legislation. And then after a co-decision is made, they pass the law. And then, of course, there's the European External Action Service, which is just hanging out there. It manages foreign policy. It's cool. Yeah, just remember, kids, it's not just these lovely four institutions running foreign policy now. It's also the European External Action Service. Fun stuff. But this leads us now to the difference, right? So you're probably asking, okay, I know there's the European Council, I know that there's the European Commission, and I know there's an EU Parliament. What's the difference? Well, here's the difference. In essence, the European Commission proposes and implements legislation, and the European Council sets the strategic direction of the European Union. The other two important institutions are the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament, who adopt legislation. European Commission is the executive body. So that wraps everything with a little bit. Now we get to go into the fun stuff. So yes, we went over some boring stuff when it came to countries, laws, and all of that good jazz. But now let's go into the countries themselves. Here's a note. We're not going to go into every Western European country. 1, I don't have the time. 2, I don't have the patience. And 3, you really can just research this for your case. I'm going to try to go over the ones that represent the current situation in Western Europe and the varying issues. So let's begin. Germany! Of course, Germany was going to be brought into the mix. Germany's leader is currently Angela Merkel, who serves as the chancellor, and she runs the parliament. Their economy right now is strong. It has a 3.67 trillion growth rate, and GDP rather, and a 2% growth rate. So in general, it's doing good. It doesn't have a lot of debt, but that's also a good thing. Its politics are at a medium risk, and the reason was because Angela Merkel just resigned. She sent in her 2-week notice, or 2-year or 2-month notice, whatever, and she is due to leave, meaning that with the rising AfD, otherwise known as the Alternative for Deutschland Party, there is now a right-wing populist group that wants to get the chancellorship. And this could be bad, because one of the last times where we had a right-wing populist be a chancellor of Germany was Hitler. So, as the AfD is promoting neo-Nazi rhetoric and is promoting xenophobia and is just being a negative influence on Germanic politics, it's clear that the next leader from the Christian Democratic Union Party, Angela's party, needs to really fight for that seat, and at the same time needs to be able to unite Germany against this front. And for the same reasons that I just explained, this has resulted at a high social risk. Not only have recent terrorist attacks really put Germany on the edge, but at the same time, they have been really seeing a resurgence of their Nazi past, and they're really trying to buckle that down as quick as possible. This isn't helping, as Angela Merkel is the head of the European Union right now, politically speaking, not institutionally speaking, and really just is seeing this wave of anti-Semitism across Europe, and that she knows her country has been somewhat responsible for. But in terms of that, foreign policy for Germany is strong. They have a very strong bid in the European Union, and they've been a very strong contender against countries like Russia, China. They have been good allies with Japan and India, and they have been managing the United States under one of the most difficult administrations to date. So Germany right now is in an okay position. But when in terms of debate, you have to keep in mind is that this may not last forever. And the resurgence of populism will most likely breed itself back where it was first birthed originally. But now we get to go to France. France is interesting. I am French Canadian myself, so I have a particular love for France. However, their current president, Emmanuel Macron, is not exactly the best president, and we're going to find out why. So let's look at their economy. Their economy is in a high-risk area right now, and I rank them high risk because while they do have a $2.5 trillion GDP rate, they have a 95% debt to GDP ratio, meaning that for all the money that they bring in every year, 95% of it goes back to paying its debt. That is a lot of money. And while debt is good in some times, and I'll explain that when we see the situation arise, it's also bad when it's overpowering you. Economist William Gale, he recently wrote a book about US economics. He argues that the ideal debt is 60%. 60% enough to keep inflation at a stable rate and enough to make sure that you have enough bonds to sell for liquid assets, but he doesn't want you to exceed 60%. Also, a big tidbit we need to acknowledge is they have an 8% unemployment rate, meaning that a lot of people are looking for jobs and they're not getting jobs, leading to the political chaos. The politics there are not doing well. And the reason why is that France right now is going under what's known as the Yellow Vest protest movement, otherwise known as the Gilets jaunes. The Gilets jaunes is essentially all of these working class people who are fed up with the high taxes that Emmanuel Macron is putting out there. They are fed up with Emmanuel Macron trying to reform the railway system, which a lot of social workers and government paid people are working in that industry. And they're really just been going on these what started out to be normal protests to now violent protests, where it's costing local businesses billions of dollars in repairs. For example, I urge you to learn about the Yellow Jacket protest or the Gilets jaunes, because the Gilets jaunes has been brought up so many times in questions. If you have a Europe topic area, you're going to get the Gilets jaunes, or you're going to end up talking about the Gilets jaunes as an example of why Europe's governing system or economic system is failing. As you can guess, social is also high risk because there's a lot of xenophobia towards Muslims. A lot of nationalists in the country want to ban religion now because they're like, well, we don't like Muslim immigrants, so if we ban religion, we're not being discriminatory, but we're also solving the problem. It doesn't work that way. So one person that is coming back to French politics and has been causing a high social risk within France is Marine Le Pen. And Marine Le Pen is a leader of the National Front, and this political party is also right-wing populist. They have said for banning religion, they have said for a flat tax, which, trust me, isn't good. And they've also been just advocating for pulling out of the European Union and becoming best allies with Russia. This isn't good. It's not going to make France stronger in the future. It's going to deteriorate them. So after Emmanuel Macron's term is served, whether or not he gets elected is really going to be a big impact on the future of French politics. Also, Emmanuel Macron, in some cases, may be better not running again and just letting another person within his party or a party that's not in the National Front run and take a coalition up. Because if Marine Le Pen actually does get the office, and she does end up controlling parliament, then it's going to spell disaster for all of France. But in addition to all of this, foreign policy is strong. An area where Emmanuel Macron knows how to act is foreign policy. He's done a lot of data initiatives, cybersecurity promotions, promoting anti-climate change, climate change solutions, and ways to really fight back against rising temperatures. His foreign policy is considered one of the best. However, at the same time, his mired presidency at home has also been hurting him. So really, France is now in this divisive area where, kind of like, this is kind of what Germany can turn out to be like if a wrong leader is elected. This is definitely a good tidbit to look at. Now we're going to go off to the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom. So as you can see, there is your new Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and who should have been the new Prime Minister, doing a dab, Lord Buckethead. Fun fact about Lord Buckethead. Lord Buckethead has run in every single election for Prime Minister, and every single time, he's made it within the top 10. He is considered a serious contender for leader. In fact, there was a funny clip where Theresa May was standing next to Lord Buckethead right before she was going to get the prime ministership, and I just thought it was funny that Lord Buckethead is just standing there as if he's an actual politician. He's great. But let's move on to the the United Kingdom, and as you can probably tell by now, Brexit. So, believe it or not, the economy is at a medium risk right now. However, depending on how Brexit goes, whether it's a no deal or it's a negotiated friendly Brexit, this could change drastically. They have a 2.6 trillion GDP. However, what makes them in a bit of a risk is that they're having a credit crisis right now in terms of monetary policy, and all of their revenues, 85% of their debt makes up all their revenues. So we really need to be aware that the United Kingdom could tip at any moment, but right now it seems relatively stable. Politics are chaotic, so we all know the story of how Brexit was voted in a referendum back in 2016. The United Kingdom voted in a slim margin, around like 49 to 50%, that they were going to leave the European Union. The problem was that no one had a plan for how they were going to leave the Union. And while they had a deadline, which was March 2019, they kept twiddling their thumbs, and it just went on forever. Theresa May gave a series of nearly 5 different deals. And although her last deal was very close to passing, the reason why people didn't want to pass it was because the European Union kind of tricked the UK, if this makes sense. So there was something in the treaty, the negotiation, the divorce deal rather, that's known as the Irish backstop, right? Because as we know, part of the United Kingdom, there's Ireland, but Ireland is split up. There's Northern Ireland, which belongs to the UK, and then there's the rest of Ireland, which belongs to the European Union. Ireland, as of now, with Northern Ireland, is part of the European Customs Union. And in the new divorce deal that Theresa May proposed, it said that they had up until 2021 to negotiate a free trade agreement that would allow Northern Ireland to act with the UK independently of the European Union on matters of trade. However, if they did not have an agreement, then Northern Ireland would be stuck in the Euro Customs Union, which would probably be is essentially the same thing as being in the EU, because you have to have EU citizenship, EU currency, all of that good jazz. You have to follow EU laws, and that would leave Britain with 2 options. One, they give up Northern Ireland, which supplies a lot of their steel goods, fishing goods, or they would join the customs union themselves. And what lawmakers argued in this most likely to happen scenario would simply bring the UK back into the European Union, but with less of a voice and less power. So everyone just freaked out for the extension period. Then Theresa May, after 3 votes, got voted out of office Boris Johnson is now the 10th prime minister, who we have to keep in mind that while he is trying to create this no-deal Brexit because he is a hardliner, he also is trying to get re-elected because in the next coming months, Britain is going to have an election for their true prime minister. Like, Boris Johnson is filling in, but he also wants to be an actual prime minister. So this makes the politics chaotic, the social issues chaotic, and the foreign policy just being Brexit, because this is all that Britain can really focus on right now. They didn't even really respond when one of their ships in the Hormuz Strait was taken out by Iran. They were like, oh, okay, well, I have to negotiate with the European Commission, so keep the ship, Iran, it's yours, I guess. So yeah, fun stuff. But if you thought the UK was bad, you haven't seen Italy. Italy is special. So pictured here is the new Prime Minister of Italy, Giuseppe Conte. And Giuseppe Conte is the leader of the Five Star Movement, who is in a coalition with the League. Both radical populist parties that pretty much want to ban immigrants, work with Russia, leave the European Union, and have a flat tax. Are you seeing the trend with right-wing populism? The economy is pictured in this slide here. Above, you will see a dumpster on fire, and that is the best way to describe Italy's economy. They have $1.9 trillion in revenue. Okay, that's good. But they also have a 131 debt to GDP ratio, and they're facing what is known as the perma-recession. In this slide, I have a link to an article that explains the perma-recession, but to keep things brief, because Italy has so much debt and is not even paying enough money to where it can pay off said debt, and it is fighting with the European Union on austerity measures and various other social recovery programs, they're just going downhill. And the thing is, the chaotic Five Star Movement and the League are not going to negotiate. They were elected because they said they would work against the European Union. And here's the funny thing. If they do leave the European Union, they would have to pay a divorce bill that would cost billions to even trillions of dollars, putting them more in debt. And they would lose access to the euro market, which is the main market they rely on for exports and cheap imports, something that they need now more than ever. So with that being said, they're at a high social risk because no one has money. Retirement programs are dwindling out, and they're also being very xenophobic to immigrants and minority groups. Foreign policy is dangerous because not only, as we just explained, is Italy turning its back on the European Union, but it's also trying to buddy up with Russia. And the thing about Russia is that what it does is that it unfairly creates deals where they gain geopolitical control over a country and its resources, buying into Russian goods that Russia needs just to sustain themselves. Essentially, the populist movement in Italy is set to put Italy under. And if nothing is done, then we're going to have problems. So this is the link to the article. But here's Greece. Now, Greece isn't all that bad. This is the current, I believe, President or Prime Minister of Greece, Perso Pozolfok. His name is very hard to pronounce. I'm so sorry. I'm not a linguist. The economy is generally weak. Greece had a near 10-year recession where they were trapped by the IMF, the ECB, and the European Commission in austerity measures, but they were also getting a lot of loans that eventually led to more debt. So that's something you need to keep in mind when talking about Greece. If you ever need an example as to why international organizations or aid doesn't help, don't cite some random African country, one that's very elitist and very Western. Just cite Greece, because Greece is just an example of how really just international institutions have failed. The politics right now, though, are stable, and the social life is stable because they are at the end of the recovery phase, and they are finding ways to really adapt to austerity. However, it did cost a lot. Their foreign policy is at a high risk because they are being bought out by China in the Belt and Road Initiative, and that could potentially lead to more debt. I'm sure in one of the lectures someone has explained debt trap, or will eventually explain it to you. So now we're going to head to the real fun, Eastern Europe. Okay, so I just got a question about the, so Italy being in the BRI. Yes, Italy is trying to get in the BRI. They have signed some deals into the BRI, but it's not so much where they're at the same risk as Greece. Because Greece right now, they're having ports being built. And that essentially is really hurting Greece in the long term, whereas Italy is just experimenting out, though it could get to the level of Greece if they are not careful. So that I'll definitely explain. Okay, so the problem about taxes in France is that the taxes are too high because they pay for social programs, but at the same time, Emmanuel Macron, in his effort to try to privatize the country, he's cutting out social services while not managing the taxes at the same time. So he's doing everything very quick. It's a theory known as shock therapy. Shock therapy is essentially when you privatize really quickly, and it really comes as a shock for economics, but at the same time, it doesn't help an economy grow. It resulted in the Soviet Union when it was moving towards, after the Soviet Union dissolved, moving towards a stronger government, essentially collapsing and leading to the rise of Vladimir Putin. And speaking of Vladimir Putin, let's go to Eastern Russia. This is honestly my favorite region. It's not talked a lot about in exam, and I really love it of when someone pulls a question from the Europe topic area, and they're like, Bosnia isn't part of Europe. Well, yes, my friend, it is, because it's Eastern Europe. Poland. So as you can probably tell, I don't like the president of Poland. I think he looks very similar to Dr. Evil, and he was recently elected. I forget his name, but I'm sure one could really find out if they were that desperate to know his identity. Also, it'll be in a news article. The economy for Poland is very good, and this is important to know for reasons that will be explained later. You can read they have over $500 billion revenue, only 50% of debt. And while 50% debt may not sound good, it actually is. Because again, they have enough debt to create bonds, but not enough debt to hinder investment in spending programs. So they have that nice equilibrium where they can play around with their liquid assets, their credit rates, and all of that fun banking stuff you'll learn in AP Econ. The growth is at 4.6%. To put things in perspective, that's more than the US economy, and it's pretty good. Their politics are chaotic because they currently have another right-wing populist government. And what they recently tried to do was lower the age of judges within Poland so that they could replace all the liberal judges with new political loyalists so they could control the judicial system. The European Union was kind of like, you can't do that, and in response, they hit them with what is known as Article 7. Article 7 basically is where the European Union slaps you and says, okay, you can't vote in certain things, your ministers will be banned from meetings, and I'm going to place some sanctions on you until you decide to atone for your actions. Poland didn't like that. So now what they're doing is they're contesting Article 13. Article 13 basically is the new copyright law that's supposed to monitor European security. Well, I'll be the first one to say that Article 13 is really stupid. It doesn't really do anything, and it really hinders the tech economy. Poland is not just contesting Article 13 because they believe in that general clause, but they're also contesting it because they see how the European Union to use these articles against them. And thus, they're going now claiming that it's rights as civil citizens and it's hindering their freedom of speech and creativity. So that's always fun. But we can now move on to Hungary. So Hungary is interesting. Hungary basically is kind of like Poland, but kind of not. So this is Viktor Orban, the current leader of Hungary, and they have a strong economy. Again, $130 billion, not much, but with a 4% growth and a $9 billion trade surplus, it's pretty good. They're in a fine position. The reason why I say their foreign policy is very dangerous and their politics are chaotic is because Viktor Orban for years has been a very abusive and dictatorial leader. He has banned certain media outlets. He has gone after journalists. He has delegitimized institutions meant to hold him accountable. And he has spread corruption throughout the Hungarian government. In addition, he wants to pull out of the Eurozone. And he doesn't want to pull out of the Eurozone, but he stopped Hungary from getting into the Eurozone and really benefiting from the free trade. In addition, he's also been debating about pulling out of the European Union. He's a Eurosceptic, and he wants to be friends with Russia. The problem with this, though, is remember that $9 billion trade surplus? Yeah, that one. 75% of that surplus was gained from the European Union. 75% of that $9 billion came from EU trade. So not only is Hungary shooting itself in the foot when it doesn't join the Eurozone, where it could potentially triple the amount it has with the lack of tariffs, but at the same time, it's also trying to plug the EU, ruin its relations, and work with Russia, which everyone knows is an unfair trader and doesn't have as much sustainability or market share as the EU has. So yeah, here we are in a little bit of a pickle. And over here are some protests back from 2011 where people were like, hey, let us join the Eurozone. We want jobs. That's another thing. The Eurozone allows people to move from country to country and have businesses spread out across Europe. Hungarians want to do that. They don't want to have to pay extra money in order to expand business. But because Viktor Orban doesn't believe in the European Union and is low-key trying to pull out of it, these people will have to suffer as a result. Meaning that in the future, this strong economy may just very well end up disappearing. And again, this is this idea of neo-functionalism that, oh, if we have a strong economy, everything else will spill over. Well, as we can see here, this isn't the case. Right. Any questions or concerns? I do not see any, so I will continue. The Balkans. The Balkans are pretty cool. So these are 8 countries, and right now their economy in general is unstable. They have a 3.8% growth that is good, but the problem with this growth is that there's a lack of infrastructure. So what it's now like is that there's a bunch of like banking monopolies that are gaining growth, but there's not a lot of middle class and lower class jobs because the infrastructure in the Balkans is so bad. Moving on from that, the politics are relatively stable. However, their social life and foreign policy is at a severe risk because of how the Balkans have recently been facing military aggression from Russia, and Russia, through its Eurasian Economic Union, has been promising it new infrastructure, but at very expensive costs and for very valuable resources, which in the end will make the Balkans less secure and less friendly with the European Union, while at the same time almost turning them into Putin's tools. Not fun. The Ukraine. All right. So this is the new Ukrainian president. I believe his name is Vladimir Peskov. I could be wrong. However, he was a comedian for the Ukraine. And yeah, funny story, he has no political experience. He ran a show in the Ukraine that was kind of like House of Cards, where a comedian gets elected president, and now he's a comedian who got elected president. And everyone's really concerned because he hasn't really said any of his policies. He hasn't taken a steady stance against Russia, which can kill him in the future. And at the same time, The economy is extremely unstable. They have $112 billion per year in growth. That's goal. They have a 2.5% growth rate, and they have 55% debt. It looks good on paper. A lot of debt to a lot of people, and at the same time, there's just been a lot of military conflict to the point where at any moment now, this good economy could tip. Furthermore, these lovely boys right here are some Ukrainian ships that Russia was like, let me take. We are all aware of what happened in the Ukraine. Basically, back in 2014, Crimea, a part of the Ukraine, was annexed by Russian military forces. Although Russia was severely punished for this action, since then they've been building ports and military bases in the Crimea and have been using it to try to get access to more ports and bases within the Black Sea. The reason why you don't want Russia getting control of the Black Sea is because that's a warm water port area where then Russia would have easy access to European countries such as Turkey and Greece and to other Middle Eastern countries, which would expand Russia's sphere of influence, something that countries within the EU and countries like the US cannot afford. Hold on. Video has been paused.